Hey guys, welcome back for chapter 10. Today we are going to be talking about campaigns and elections. We'll look a little bit about how that process happens, how it played out in 2020, so on and so forth. So we'll get started here. Lots of learning targets for this chapter. So we'll talk about the presidential primaries, factors that influence it, how it happens, talk a little bit about how campaigns can shape the outcome of presidential elections. We'll talk a little bit about how voters learn about candidates through the campaign process. Um, and then talk a little bit about presidential versus congressional elections, political parties' involvement in elections, how do they actually affect public policy, and we're going to talk a little bit about campaign finance. So, lots of stuff to cover today, but hopefully this is a fairly exciting AP Gov topic for you guys. And as always, let me know if you have questions. So here are kind of our guiding questions for this chapter. First one is how do American elections determine the type of people that govern us, or the kinds of people that do? And so the way in which our elections are set up really allow a candidate to display their personal appeal, right? Their character, those sorts of things. And party endorsement is most definitely important as well. But when we're talking about the early stages of a campaign and the nominations process, really personal appeal is everything. Do people like the candidates? Do people like their attitude, their personality, all of those things? And so those things are really taken into consideration in the nominations process and the primary process. Once we get into the general election, we do see a stronger ideological orientation towards the liberal and conservative causes, and that sort of two-party structure play out. But personal appeal is important. What matters most in deciding who wins? Really, it's about who turns out to vote and what their party identification is. It's estimated that only about 10 to 20% of American voters are true independents who could be swayed in a given election. And so a lot of the election comes down to, can you turn out your base? Can you get your supporters to the polls? You can make every ditch effort to sway that 10 to 20% in the middle, but you may not even need them if you can sway your supporters and get them to the polls. So who turns out to vote is incredibly important. Oftentimes politicians are going to pick on issues that are really of utmost importance to voters, things like the economy, foreign affairs, right, if we're in wartime, presidential character, those sorts of things. And then, do elections actually make a real difference in what laws get passed? And they absolutely do. During campaigns, parties are going to talk a lot about some of the core issues that their supporters care about. There's going to be some issues that the parties will actually sound similar on, and that more or less is to attract centrist voters. Once someone is elected to office, and especially if they have their party holding the majority in Congress as well, definitely going to have an influence on public policy, right? They're going to try and push some of those sort of platform points through while they have support in Congress and that sort of thing. So, talking a little bit about campaigns today, candidates are going to hire people to perform several different campaign tasks. They're going to hire media consultants whose jobs are to make ads and buy airtime from TV and radio stations, so that you can get those lovely political ads in the weeks leading up to the election. We also have direct mail firms. Those are companies that design and produce mailings to help either promote a candidate or raise money for a particular candidate. So these things, I have a picture of one here for John Doe, for school board, right? But these mailings often, come through snail mail and they go in the trash really quickly, but they are still important to candidates and campaigns, because they help with the name recognition piece, right? Even if I don't read through it and I throw it right in the garbage, I'll have seen that person's name. And that can have an effect, especially for lower political offices that we're not as familiar with, or we don't necessarily know the candidates or the issues at hand. Name recognition can be really important. Candidates are also going to hire polling firms to survey voters on their attitudes towards the issues, towards the candidates, so that they can have a more informed campaign. So we talked in a couple chapters ago about big data, and how that plays in to campaigns, and campaigns are going to hire polling experts and analysts to gather all of this data so that they can use their resources more effectively, and hopefully that'll help their campaign. There's also a number of political technology firms whose job is to design websites and online ads and run social media and do online fundraising and work with all of the voter data that they can gather from different websites as well. Now, all of this comes with a price tag, right? So I just updated these notes this week, and the most updated statistic I had in here was from 2016. And I had said in 2016 that we had spent, about $5.5 billion, right, on campaigns. When we consider even like governor's races and things like that, it all totaled up to about $7.1 billion. I am glad I updated this stat because in 2020 that number doubled. Combined races in the 2020 campaign cycle cost $14 billion, which is just crazy, right? An immense amount of money. And so the most expensive part of that for any campaign is usually those media consultants and advertisements. When we look at campaign ads, oftentimes they target voters' fears. Depending on the campaign, some campaigns work pretty hard to engage positive emotions for their ads. Can get really draining when all you see is negative ads, right? Now, it's unclear if ads actually have an influence on election outcomes. It's hard for us to measure that. It's hard for us to measure, like, oh, if people spend more money, they're going to win. To some degree, that could be true. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of these notes. But we think they're important because, again, we go back to the name recognition piece. They get people's names out there, right? But it's hard for us to measure how big of an impact they actually have. Now, we're going to look at some pros and cons of like modern campaign practices. So the first one is extensive polling, and we talked about this with big data. One of the pros of extensive polling is that one, it's just really great and productive for the candidate. it allows them to use their results, their information to design ads, to design even their platform, like their positions on issues, in a way that it truly targets their potential voting bloc. Now, the con of that is there is so much polling, and we as voters don't like it that much. We get sick of answering, right? We don't like the junk text messages asking us to participate, any of that, right? And you can make an argument for how much data do you want a campaign to have about you, right? The more polling, the more data that they have. So lots of high-tech canvassing or micro-targeting done. The big pro of micro-targeting or kind of narrowing in on our voting bloc is that it makes campaigns cheaper and more effective. So even though there's $14 billion spent on races in 2020, could have been 20 billion, right? If we didn't use some of these modern practices. The con, again, is kind of about consumer data. We are using data about consumer habits extensively. We're looking at, do you buy coffee or do you make it at home? What kind of car do you drive? All of these things to determine who our audience is, right? Things that are totally unrelated or feel unrelated, but at some point or another, they've been said to, be able to help identify your group, right? Your group of voters. The problem there is privacy, right? Again, how much information do we need these campaigns to have on us? We've also seen an increase in campaign spending, right? As I showed you on the last slide. Campaigning and fundraising, those two words are pretty much synonymous, right? And that has its pros and cons, right? You and I can donate to campaigns because we care about an issue, and we should probably be able to do that, right? But there's also different organizations that can get involved, there's corporations that can get involved, so on and so forth, and the spending is just crazy, right? And you think about $14 billion. How else could that be used in our economy besides campaigning, right? So that can be problematic. All right, we're going to look at 2020. We're going to talk about the nominations process, and I want to use the 2020 election to kind of demonstrate how we got to where we are right now. So the first step is nominations. You have to get nominated by your political party, and that requires a lot of individual effort. All of these people on your screen were in the race for the presidency in 2020 at one point and another. And so we need to narrow that down. How's that happen? How do we get from here to here, right? And that's what we're going to look at next. Before we look at how that happens, it's important to note that both of our two major political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, are catch-all or big tent parties. That means within the Democratic Party or within the Republican Party, there's many different subtypes of voters, right? They may have different views on different issues. The subtypes identified in this diagram were Black voters who, as I said in previous units, have overwhelmingly supported the Democratic Party. Millennials, the left, party loyalists, Asian and Hispanic voters. Okay, and then we look at like how do these candidates appeal to these different voters, right? And all of that is important when we're thinking about who do we nominate for this office, right? When we have so many different subtypes, right? You look at say Joe Biden, his rating for the left was not that close, right? He may struggle to get Bernie Sanders, Joe, and Elizabeth Warren supporters, right? Because we have all of these subtypes. So that makes picking a nominee hard. The Republican Party also has many subtypes as well, just like the Democratic Party. So how do we narrow this down? Step one, each state needs to hold a caucus or a primary. They start in February of an election year. The Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire primary are traditionally the first to go. Now, those states that are the first to go are important to us because they give us an idea of where this whole thing is headed, right? Step two, the candidates compete in these caucuses and primaries to earn delegates, okay? These delegates are going to go on and vote for them later on in the nominations process. Reminder, at this stage in the campaign, we have Democrats running against other Democrats and Republicans running against other Republicans. Step three then is we get all of our delegates and then we go and attend a national convention and we officially choose our presidential candidate. Okay. Looks like I did not update this. In 2016, the Democrats were in Philadelphia for their convention and the Republicans were in Cleveland. Much of the Democratic National Convention was held virtually this year, while the Republican National Convention, they had portions at the White House, so on and so forth. So a little bit different year with being in the midst of a pandemic. These national conventions usually happen around July or August, and they are where we officially nominate a candidate for office. So nominations are all about getting delegates. So I have some pictures here of different events. We have delegates at the 2008 Democratic Convention who are there to cast their vote for who will become President Obama. Delegates at the 2012 Republican Convention, right? These are just like big parties. The Republican delegation from Texas in 2012, they got their matching outfits, right? Kind of fun. Okay, so how do we win them? Couple different ways. You can have a caucus, right? Which I've used that term a couple of times. So a caucus is like an old-fashioned political meeting where we're all going to get together like in our school, in our neighborhood somewhere, and we're going to discuss who is it that we want to nominate for the upcoming election, right? It's like an old-fashioned discussion. All right, so I want to demonstrate to you kind of how this works. And to do that, we're going to look at the Democratic Precinct Caucus for 2020 that happened in Precinct 43 in Des Moines, Iowa. So at this point, we still have quite a few Democrats in the race for the presidency. And so we have 472 Democrats of varying ideologies show up. And so we have Warren supporters there, we have Buttigieg supporters, Bernie Sanders supporters, Andrew Yang was still in the race, Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, and of course Joe Biden, who will eventually become the nominee. So the first step in a precinct caucus is to join your presidential preference groups. And so you go in and you're just like, hey, I'm caucusing for Amy Klobuchar today. And you go join your little pod, right? And then they're going to do an initial count. So in the initial count in Des Moines, Warren had 124, followed by Buttigieg at 97, Sanders at 96, Klobuchar at 71, Biden at 68, and then Andrew Yang at 16. Now, the next step. You need to be viable. These are the rules for the Democratic caucus in Iowa. You need to be viable. In Iowa, the viability threshold, is what they call it, is 15%. So you need 15% of supporters to be there in order to be able to go to the next round of counting. Now, at the end of round 1, in this precinct, you needed 71 to be viable. Andrew Yang and Joe Biden have not met that. So then the non-viable groups either must join other groups, go home. If you're like strong Andrew Yang supporter, I'm not here for anyone else, you can just go. Or you need to convince enough people to join your group that you become viable. So Biden is close, right? He's got 68. He needs 3 more people to join his group to be viable. So his campaign's not going to give up here. Andrew Yang's is. What happens next is precinct captains from each of the different campaigns try and convince the non-viables to join their group before the recount. They do a recount. This is the effect of the recount. So Warren gains a couple supporters, Buttigieg, Sanders, Biden gets up there. He's close enough now. He's going to be viable. He's able to convince some people to join him. Klobuchar gains 1. So they do this final count. This precinct has 9 delegates. That's based on their population. So they have 9 delegates that they can send to the county convention. They divide their votes proportionally. So Warren has the most supporters. She gets 3 of the delegates. Buttigieg and Sanders walk away with 2. Biden and Klobuchar walk away with 1. Now, each of these campaigns are going to choose their delegates. So who are we going to send to vote on behalf of all of us? Right? So they're going to pick their people, and those people are highlighted in yellow. Those 9 delegates go to the Polk County Convention with 170 other precincts from Polk County. It's a big county in Iowa. After the county convention, they go to the state convention. And then after the state convention, we get to the national convention, where finally someone is formally nominated. Now, it used to be that the Democratic Party had superdelegates, and superdelegates were super important in winning the Democratic nomination. So a superdelegate is someone who's free to support any candidate that they please. They're not tied or pledged to the results of a party's caucus or a primary result, right? The people we just talked about that are going to the county convention and state convention and so on and so forth, they're tied to those results. They have to go and support how their county decided. Not a superdelegate. Now, in 2016, Clinton secures like all of the superdelegates, and that year the Democratic Party had 712 superdelegates. So she secures all of these superdelegates. She's already like a quarter or a third of the way to winning the Democratic nomination without needing a single vote from people like you and me, right? These are like Congress people and other higher ups in the government that are given this like superdelegate title. The Sanders campaign is not happy about this in 2016. So the Democratic Party changes their rules. So in 2020, unless a candidate had already received a majority of the pledged delegates, then superdelegates could only vote in the second round of voting at the national convention. So they don't have an impact at all in round one unless the candidate has won a majority of pledged delegates already. Then like there's not going to be a round two, so they can like ceremoniously cast their vote, right? So superdelegates only exist in the Democratic Party, and that's because parties and states have control over how they do this nominations process. And states ultimately have the final say in elections. Now, you can do a caucus or you can do a primary. A primary looks like a regular election, except the ballot only has Democrats or only has Republicans on it. So, you cannot, in most cases, you cannot ticket split in a primary, meaning you can't vote for a Democrat for president and a Republican for Senate. But there are some exceptions here. So there's two different types of primaries. The first is an open primary, and the second is a closed primary. So in North Dakota, we have an open primary ballot. What that means is on election day, on primary election day, we can decide which primary we want to participate in. Can't participate in both, you can't ticket split, but you can show up to the poll and you can participate in the Dem-MPL primary or the Republican primary. You don't have to be pre-registered in advance. In a closed primary, you have to be a registered voter who is registered with the party. So on your voter registration, you need to indicate that you are a Democrat or a Republican in order to participate in the next primary for that party. Main difference between a caucus and a primary, or an important difference, is voter turnout. So you can see the percentages for groups that caucus, states that caucus, versus states that primary. Now, one thing I want to note is that in some states, the Republicans will do one thing and the Democrats will do another, because parties have control over this nomination process. So in North Dakota, for the presidency, the Democratic Party does a caucus. The Republican Party relies on primary results. The Democratic Party in North Dakota, for all lower offices, everything below the president, Senate, House, so on and so forth, they would use primary election results for those if we had to narrow the field, right? So you had 3 Democrats that wanted to run for one open US Senate seat. We would use a primary. But for the presidency, they use a caucus. So it can vary a little bit. But one of the major differences between the two is just an immense difference in voter turnout. And a lot of this has to do with the time involved, right? If you're going to go attend a caucus, it's going to take a whole evening. Where if you're going to attend a primary, you could go vote over your lunch break. So that's why they have higher rates, higher turnout rates. All right, so then we have the convention. Each party holds a 4-day convention or so to officially nominate their candidate and sell their candidate to the American people. At this point, we've been tracking delegates through the whole process, right? We live in a 24-hour media cycle, so we've been tracking candidates through this whole process, and so we normally know going into the convention who is going to be the nominee. Lots of clapping and balloons and confetti. Now 2020 is different because like the Democratic convention didn't have spectators. But normally you would have delegates and then party members attend the convention, right? Those are like party insiders. Now, it used to be that this nominations process was something that largely happened behind closed doors. The parties have kind of changed their rules to allow us average people to be more involved in the process now. So I would say today, this process is a little bit more democratic than it was years back when the higher ups in the party would just sit in a room and they'd be like, who should we make run for president next? Right? And so I'd be curious what you guys think, like the pros and cons of that may be. Should we be more democratic? Maybe we need to be even more democratic than like caucuses, right? Because maybe they're not that inclusive. So, all things to think about. There may also be some pros to having party insiders pick your candidates, right? Those are the people that like have a lot of access to information and kind of know what's going on. In Europe, party organizers decide like everything, like who's allowed to run, which candidates are going to appear on the ballot, all of that. So like I said, this process has changed a little bit. That's all laid out for you in this table. We won't read through all of that because that is available to you. But it used to be that old style campaigning involved parades, rallies, train stops, shaking hands with voters, and that still exists to some degree, right? You think of like President Trump's rallies. I mean, similar sort of concept. It's not a parade, but it's kind of a promotional event. Newer campaigns involve more television, other forms of broadcasting to reach the public. So the consequence of that change in campaign strategies is that the whole campaign for, especially for federal offices, can feel a little bit more disconnected for the voter, right? There's less voter contact, so on and so forth. And so, the Secret Service probably loves it because they don't have to deal with as much voter contact in like a parade, right? But it makes it feel a little bit more disconnected for the public. Now, why does the campaign even matter, right? What are the things that we hope to get out of it? First, it allows the candidates to really assign credit or blame for the state of the nation, right? Oftentimes, voters view the president as the one who's responsible for the wellness of the country. And so the opponent of the current president can talk about what's going wrong, right? Assign blame. The current president can take credit for the things that are going well, all of that. Also activates latent partisanship. What I mean by that is that most of us are not all that involved in politics, especially in non-election years. And so campaigns serve as a way for political parties to kind of fundraise and beef themselves up a little bit because they get people more involved. And then it allows us to judge the candidate's character, right? What is it that we want in a president? What is it that we want in policy? All of those things we can learn through a campaign. Now, voters learn about candidates in a few different ways, right? They can learn about them through campaign communications like TV ads and social media ads and all of those things. Those things, of course, all require money, but then there's also a ton of campaign events going on in the background. So those would be debates, conventions, public events like I mentioned, President Trump's rallies, meeting with voters, like you can see Joe Biden doing here. They're often going to do that in like swing states. So they're going to spend a lot of time in states that are going to be close, razor-thin margins, right? Rather than in states like North Dakota, where you are likely to have a safe Republican seat, right? All right, so next we're going to move into campaign finance. So when you're filling out an income tax return, there will be this box that says like presidential election campaign. Check here if you or your spouse want $3 to go to this fund. And you can opt to do that or not. Now, it's not going to change your income tax bill. It's just going to reallocate $3 of funds to this presidential election campaign. So you can opt to do that or not. Now, lots of people ask, what's the money go towards? Who am I financing, right? So we're going to take a look at that on the next slide. So this is called presidential matching funds. And what it does is it matches the first $250 of a citizen's contribution. So if someone gives $250 to the Biden campaign, then presidential matching funds can give the Biden campaign another $250. Likewise for the Republican candidate, right, for President Trump. It also gives some money to political parties to help fund their political conventions. Now, why would we redistribute income tax dollars to fund presidential campaigns? Seems kind of silly, right? But the kicker is if a candidate decides that they're going to take advantage of presidential matching funds, then they must agree to spending limits on campaigns. Now, the goal would be to reduce a candidate's dependence on large contributions from special interest groups. This is a problem, right? And so we're going to talk about how that comes to be. There's kind of a pattern here, right? Congress will try and do something about campaign finance, and then there's a court case attempting to overturn part of a law passed by Congress, and it results in what we call a loophole, a way to get around the law, right? Same thing happens over here. So we'll look at a couple of different campaign laws. The first is the Federal Election Campaign Act. It was passed in two parts. It's the act that creates this public financing system, so presidential matching funds. Contributions also had to be disclosed to the Federal Election Commission, so we have this part of the bureaucracy that's kind of overseeing donations to campaigns, and we limit candidate spending if a candidate accepted public financing. Now, the original law limited spending even if they didn't accept financing, even if they used their own money, and it banned all independent expenditures, which is money that's spent on campaigns independent of the campaigns. Now, the reason this law is passed is because after Watergate, right, look at the years here, after Watergate, there's this focus on limiting corruption in campaigns. So that's the goal here, right? Limit some corruption. However, in the court case Buckley v. Vallejo, they try and overturn parts of this law. And they are successful in overturning these three pieces. Now, in Buckley v. Vallejo, the Supreme Court ruled that limits on electoral expenditures, campaign finance, were a violation of the First Amendment freedom of speech. What the court argues is that how you spend your money is symbolic speech. If I spend my money on a particular candidate, that is symbolic for me supporting that candidate in the election. This sets a precedent that money is speech. How you spend your money is speech. That becomes a precedent that the Supreme Court is expected to follow in future cases. Another congressional law, The Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act comes around in 2002. It's another attempt by Congress to limit corruption, right? So what they do in this law is they eliminate soft money. This is money that's given to political parties for party building, but all it was political parties were given money and then they just reallocate it to candidates, and there wasn't a traceable path. It eliminates that. Hard money limits are increased. So that's money given directly to the candidates. Because we eliminate soft money, we allow people to spend more directly with the candidates. There's an existing ban on foreign money at this point already that is beefed up and strengthened. Candidate disclosure, or having to kind of display your financial records for the campaign, that is beefed up as well. Unions, corporations, and nonprofits were prohibited from broadcasting electioneering communications within 60 days of a general election or 30 days of a primary. So unions, corporations, and nonprofits cannot be spending money on campaigns independently of the campaigns within 60 days of the general election. And then minors were prohibited from making political contributions. Now there's two laws here. The first, or two SCOTUS decisions. The first is McConnell versus FEC. McConnell versus FEC, they overturned that piece about minors. Minors still have freedom of speech to some degree. They should be able to give to campaigns. That's found unconstitutional. Then we have Citizens United versus FEC. Campaign finance law was already kind of looked at as like, we have a leaking dam, right? We have some loopholes, we have some ways to get around the law. Citizens United blows the dam wide open, right? Creates a major loophole in campaign finance. How's it do that? It overturns this piece on unions and corporations. Unions, interest groups, corporations go to the court saying their freedom of speech is being infringed on. Now, they are not people, right? They're unions and corporations. But the court agrees with them. The court overturns this part of the law. Now we kind of have a precedent that corporations, unions, nonprofits have freedom of speech just like regular people do, okay? Blows the floodgates open, allows for a lot more corporate spending in elections. All right, we're going to look at what the Federal Election Commission can all see. So they're going to be able to see campaign donations to candidates, political action committees, and super PACs, which are all just different types of, organized political committees. So all disclosed donations are found on the FEC website. Even you can find it. You can go check it out. They're only going to show you names for people that donate over $250 to a single candidate in a campaign cycle. So you will not find my name on the FEC website because I do not have $250 to spend on campaigns in a single election cycle, right? But you can look up all of these donations on that website. Now, this is like tax code stuff, but it's important for understanding some of the loopholes in campaign finance. So a 527 is an organization under Section 527 of the tax code that can raise and spend money to advance political causes. They're political action committees, okay? So one example is like Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. Okay, they spent all of their money saying that John Kerry, who was running for office at the time, was unfit and unpatriotic for that office. Okay, and so their campaign is actually so effective that it creates its own term here called swift boating, which is to institute a smear campaign against a candidate and attack their patriotism. You can find this ad on YouTube. It's kind of funny. So then we have 501c4s, which are nonprofit organizations that are exempt from income tax, but donations to them are not tax deductible. So you can't write off your donations when you're filling out your tax form. These are what we call shell corporations in campaign finance. They have no active business operations or significant assets. They're not illegal. They're allowed according to the tax code, but they have this loophole, this way of disguising business activities from the public. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a couple slides. Now, we said independent expenditures are groups spending money independently of the campaign. And both of our federal laws regarding campaign finance try and ban or limit these, but both times the Supreme Court finds these bans unconstitutional. Now, super PACs are known as independent expenditure only committees. They cannot make contributions to candidates, okay? But they can engage in unlimited political spending independently of the campaign. They can spend all the money they want making ads convincing you that a candidate is good or is not good. They just can't give the money straight to the candidate. They're different from traditional PACs in that they can raise funds from individuals and corporations as well as unions and other groups without any legal limit on donation size. For a traditional PAC, you have a legal limit of about $5,000 per campaign cycle. So here's the loophole. You have a corporation up in this top left-hand corner. The traditional way of giving money was, one, you can either give it directly to the candidate or you can give money to the PAC. And so when you give money to a political action committee, your contributions are limited, $5,000, and they're disclosed. Your name is associated with them. Then this PAC can give money to the candidate. And so we have to do a little bit of searching on the FEC website, but we can see that PAC gave money to Joe Biden, and then we can click on that PAC and we can go see who gave money to that PAC. So now we can see how you indirectly supported Joe Biden for president, right? But we can look it up. We can trace it. If we give money to a super PAC, our contributions are unlimited. We could give $5 million and they're disclosed. We can see that money was given to this PAC. This PAC, however, cannot give money to Joe Biden, this super PAC. Instead, they can only spend their own money on creating their own independent expenditures, which are going to have an indirect influence on the election, right? They're still making ads. They're still going to have an influence on the election. Now, a corporation may want to hide their money, right? They don't want people to know that they're giving money to political causes because it could make them lose clientele. So how would they do that? They're going to give money to a shell corporation, a 501c4. The US tax code does not view a 501c4 as any sort of organization that is politically motivated. According to the tax code, they are for educational purposes. So we have this shell corporation. Because they're not technically politically affiliated, our contributions are unlimited and they're also not disclosed. This shell corporation can then give money to the super PAC. So when we're looking at the FEC website, we can see, oh, Shell Corporation gave money to super PAC, but we don't have a way of connecting this Shell Corporation back to the corporation. This money is untraceable. We can't figure out who did this corporation give money to in the campaign. So it creates this loophole. Now, when it comes to money and winning, like, why do we care so much about how much money is spent in an election? Because it is not technically a decisive factor in presidential elections. It tends to be more important in congressional elections, um, especially in districts that are not safe seats, right, where they could swing between supporting the Democratic or the Republican candidate. Um, when it comes to presidential elections, the more important factors are like the economic conditions of the country, the character of the candidate, things like that. I want to give you one example of a congressional race. A few years back, Jon Ossoff, who actually is currently running for an open Georgia Senate seat, he was running in Georgia's 6th district for House. He's a Democrat running against Karen Handel, the Republican. Ossoff outspends Handel 2-1 and still doesn't win the election. However, this is a safe Republican district in Georgia. So normally, people like Handel would win by 20 points or more. Ossoff narrows that margin to a 3 to 4 point margin. So he loses the 6th district 48 to 52 percentage points, approximately. That's a close race. Money wasn't divisive, but it had an impact, right? It made it more realistic that he could maybe actually win. And like I said, he's currently running for a Senate seat in Georgia. 13 keys to the White House. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this, but basically, this was your textbook talks more about this, but this was a way of predicting election outcomes that was developed by Alan Lichtman. And basically, he looks at a number of different things going on that he calls keys to the White House to make a determination about whether or not the incumbents party, so the current office holders party, or the non-incumbents party is going to win the popular vote. So we had he'll look at is there a serious contest? Is the incumbent up for re-election? What sort of policy changes are going on? What sort of social unrest is going on? Are there scandals going on? And so he looks at these 13 different factors and he can make a determination about who is going to win the presidency. And this man has been right for decades since he's been doing this. Okay? And so there's more information on that in the book. He predicted a Biden win in 2020, right again, right? And so take a minute to look that up. It's kind of an interesting thing that he's developed there. These are the different keys to the White House. So you just look at the description and say whether it's true or false. If 5 or fewer are false, the incumbent party will win. If 6 or more are false, the challenging party will win, according to Lichtman's predictions. Last couple slides here, guys, bear with me. So I want to talk about presidential versus congressional campaigns. This chart is available for you to fill out in your notes packets. Presidential races are generally more competitive, less safe. More voters are going to participate in a presidential election versus a midterm election where just congressional seats are up, so on and so forth. There is an incumbency advantage in congressional races. You have more name recognition, more access to funds, things like that. You can also pass off the blame of things that aren't going well to other congressmen or the president, so on and so forth. Congressional races have become increasingly more independent of presidential races. They're kind of doing their own thing. Now, how does all of this affect policy? The American system of government moderates the pace of change. Government's a slow-moving ship, slow-moving train, whatever you want to call it. Moves slowly. That makes it really hard to adopt any radical policies quickly. Lots of compromise involved in the process. Now, when there is a dramatic shift as a result of an election, say a single party holds the House, the Senate, the presidency, and even a majority on the Supreme Court, policy can change dramatically fairly quickly. That's what happened with the New Deal. And then campaign promises do often become policy. Here, President Obama is signing the Affordable Care Act, which we often refer to as Obamacare. But those policies can take time to formulate. They require compromise with the opposition. So what he's signing here in the final version of the bill definitely didn't look exactly like what he handed over initially, right? It requires some compromise. And all of that results in less radical policies, which many American voters would argue that's a good thing, right? All right, we're gonna flip past these last couple slides, and that is all, folks. Thanks for sticking with me. I know that's a long lecture video, but let me know what you have for questions, and I look forward to discussing this with you guys. Have a good rest of your day.